Okay. The Shoah was a trauma for the Jewish people. A trauma is something that sometimes affects you without your realizing. Now, when I say it was a trauma for the Jewish people, I mean the whole Jewish people. Whether you were in a camp or not in a camp, whether you are the second generation of somebody who went through the Shoah, sometimes even the third generation of somebody who went through the Shoah. So it's a trauma. That's number one. And I saw this book a few months ago written by a social worker, and it was called Dealing with the Trauma of the Second Generation. There's such a thing. There was an Israeli film which was called The Summer of Avia, starring actress Gila Almagor, about a woman who'd gone through the Shoah and how she was treating her daughter. She was paranoid about all these things, and the daughter, of course, suffered because of the mother's paranoia. The truth is, I mean, I'm not telling you things you don't know. Because I don't mean just that. What I mean is that here in Romania, I'm sure you're familiar with these issues. You have, first of all, the generation who went through the Shoah. You have the generations of people who are afraid to say that they were Jews under the communists. You have the generation of the people who are afraid to say they were Jews until very recently. And that affects. You know, one time I was in Krakow they have the Jewish Music Festival in Krakow at the end of June every year. And I met there a woman who I met in Hebrew University. She was from Poland, and she had converted to Judaism. She had some roots, whatever. And we were sitting in, it's called the Museum of Galicia Museum in Krakow. It's really a photography museum. And this lady was sitting there who was a Shoah survivor. And she looks at this Polish woman who at the time was maybe 25 years old. And the first thing she says to her is, if you were in the Shoah, they wouldn't know you're Jewish. It's like about, hello, how are you? My name is, it's like, I'm sure she didn't realize that was like inappropriate. Because she's living in a certain mindset, and hey, I haven't been to Poland for many years, and this is Galicia Museum. I can say whatever I want, right? So, another story from Krakow. There was a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Boaz Pash. He was asked to be the rabbi of Krakow for about almost 6 years, I think he spent. He lives in Israel. And he told me a story one time of a fellow, they have what's called the Children of the Shoah organization, which is elderly people who were children during the Shoah. And they would meet every Sunday in the JCC, the Jewish Community Center. So there was one fellow from the Children of the Shoah, and he said, Rabbi Pash, I want you to come visit me. I don't want to talk. But when you come to me, I want you to realize, Shalom, welcome. I want you to realize that my neighbors don't know that I'm Jewish. Don't know that I'm Jewish. So please, if you're wearing a kippah under your hat, and he has peyot, the long curls, he says, please put that under your hat too. Don't make it obvious that you're Jewish, because my neighbors don't know. So he says, okay, no problem. So he goes to the other side of the Vistula River where this fellow lives, and he's about to knock on the door, and he sees on the door, there's a sign with a name, Goldberg. Like, right, nobody in the building knows he's Jewish. It's like, people live in like their imaginative world, but, and they don't realize that, in Montreal, where I grew up, there were many survivors who came after the war to Montreal. A significant amount of the Jewish community were survivors. And my father used to tell me about certain people who they still felt like the war hadn't stopped. They refused to say that they were Jewish. They would act in ways not to create too much suspicion or things like that. It's like they didn't understand the word stuff. And this is, post-traumatic stress. And post-traumatic stress is something that you feel and also gets absorbed by those who are close to you. Another story. I worked in Hebrew University for 3 years. I was in charge of their religious programming in the synagogue. And during that time, there was a terrorist activity in, it's called the Frank Sinatra Cafeteria. That building was actually given by Frank Sinatra. So it's called the Sinatra Cafeteria. Somebody had planted a bomb in the cafeteria. People were killed. This happened many years ago. I'm talking about maybe 2001, many years ago. And there was somebody I knew, a student at the university, and she was sitting in that cafe when it happened with her boyfriend, and he died in that terrorist incident, and she was injured. She got pieces of shrapnel from the bomb into her neck. And so for about a month, she was wearing a brace, after they removed the shrapnel. And then one day I see her walking by and she's not wearing the brace. I said, a brace is sort of like a bandage that goes around your neck. She walked by and she wasn't wearing the bandage. I said, how are you? She said, not so good. I said, why? Said, when I was wearing the bandage, people knew that something was wrong. And then they asked me what was wrong and I told them. Now that I'm not wearing the bandage, they think everything's fine, but everything is not fine. But I have to pretend that everything's fine because, why are you complaining? They took off the bandage. Yes. It was like 2000, 2001. Yeah, that happened. So I'm just saying that, whatever, I mean, there are lots and lots of stories when you live in Israel. So, but I'm just saying that trauma is something that affects people. So now I want to focus on the Shoah in particular. The Zionist movement went through a few stages. I'm not going to go that far back because we talked about this, but there was the Russian Zionist movement, which actually had its first conference here in Fokshan, somewhere around 1880 or something like that. You could look it up on Professor Wikipedia, they'll tell you exactly the year. But the Fokshan was, of course, local. It was Romanian delegates, and then they had in Katowice, somewhere around 1890 something. No, before that, must have been before that. It must have been around 1880. I can't remember, but please check that. In Katowice, which had delegates from all around the Jewish world, and that was from the Chibat Zion Russian Zionist movement, the Chovevei Zion movement. And when was Katowice? Katowice? If you could check. So 1881, Fokshan, right before the first Aliyah. Very interesting. Maybe it was 1891. It was a few years later that they had in Katowice with their intervention. The Chibat Zion Zionist movement was, it was a little more traditional. You had the secularists and traditionalists working hand in hand. Herzlian Zionism, which starts in 1897 at the Congress in Basel, was led by a leadership which was more secular, and it created some arguments within the Jewish world. And the question really was it going to be successful or not? And there was even questions within the Jewish world, is it worth the price that you have to pay to bring Jews to the land of Israel when there's no food, there's no economy, there are no jobs, there's malaria? Is it the right thing to do? I mean, what's wrong with living in Poland? There is Jewish life there. Romania. Okay, it's true, there's anti-Semitism in certain parts of Europe, but life is livable. That was the thinking of the 19th century. And so in the early 20th century, the people came who set up kibbutzim and moshavim these settlements really had to work against, it was not a simple thing to do. I can tell you, after the first and second Aliyah, the majority of people who came to Israel left. I always say it's better to have loved and lost than not to have loved at all. At least they tried, okay? And they did a lot, they accomplished a lot. But I don't blame people who found life difficult and then gave up. That happens. The ones who didn't give up, they all got government positions after when the state of Israel was set up, or at least in the Jewish agency. But a lot of people, it was difficult. They knew it was difficult. When they came, they were 18 years old, 20 years old. Probably by the time they hit 30, their parents said, enough is enough. So I can understand that. A lot of the early Zionists were very young. Aleph Dalet Gordon, who I mentioned his name, he came to Israel when he was 44. They called him the grandfather, the old man, okay? Because everybody else was in their 20s when they came. They were young people. Ben Gurion was called the old man already when he was 40 years old. He died in his 70s, but maybe he made it to 80. But he was called the old man from a young age. Anyhow, so for the Zionist movement, welcome. I'm going to just jump forward for a moment. In 1948, the decision had to be taken because the British were leaving Palestine. The British actually only got a mandate from the UN to be there for a few years, but they kept staying and kept staying and kept staying. Right? Their mandate started in 1917. And in 1917, they were told by the United Nations, please help the Jews set up a state. But they never left. Okay, 1917 to 1948, that's 21 years. They never left. Excuse me, 31 years. What am I saying? They just didn't go. So when things weren't working out, they decided to leave. And then Ben Gurion realized this is the opportunity. And of course, the story goes that Harry Truman was the president of the United States. Maybe I told you this story. And he sent an envoy. Well, there was an envoy from it was called the Jewish Agency. That was the shadow cabinet. And came to Truman. Truman said, I support what you're doing, but it's really not smart to declare a state. There are 7 Arab armies that are going to attack you according to our information. So maybe don't wait a little bit. We'll work it out. We'll have discussions and we'll try to come up to some agreement. So Ben Gurion was told this. And he turned to Yigal Allon, who at that time was his person in charge of intelligence. And he said, Yigal, what are the chances of our winning a war against 7 Arab armies? And Allon said, probably not better than 50-50. And then Ben Gurion said, in the last 2,000 years, when did the Jewish people have such good odds at getting back the land of Israel? But the truth is, that statement was not just blind belief. This was 1948. This was 3 years after the Shoah. The Jewish people felt, Ben Gurion for sure, that our backs are against the wall. If we don't create a state, there is nothing to defend the Jewish people. And I've always said, I didn't make this up, somebody else did, but it's a lovely thing. I saw this 2 years ago. Somebody wrote on Facebook. In Israel, we have 2 commemorative days, 1 week apart. One of them right after Passover is Yom HaShoah, the day of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. And then a week later, we have Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for soldiers. So somebody wrote on Facebook, and it went viral in Israel, said, Yom HaZikaron, Soldier Memorial Day, is the price that we have to pay in order to have a state of Israel. And Yom HaShoah is the price we had to pay when we didn't have the state of Israel. So Ben Gurion understood this. He wasn't being cute. He felt that it was now or never. And you don't get these opportunities. They don't come back 5 years later, even with good intentions. It happens once in a lifetime. And I think I don't know if he was Russia or Poland. I think he was from Russia. His original name was Greenberg, David Greenberg. It was the custom to Hebraize your name in the early years. In fact, they didn't even give you a position in government or in the army unless you Hebraized your name. That's just today they don't do that anymore, but in the early years, definitely in the 1950s, 60s, and at that time, you had to Hebraize your name. It was just a thing. So, which they learned from other countries, because Jews did that wherever country they went to. Right? They Hebraized they anglicized their names, they francophoned their names, they Romanized their names, right? Depending what country you're in. So in Israel, they Hebraized their names. It was going back to the. He was born in Poland. Okay. Okay. Yes. So this feeling, the feeling of the early government of Israel was that the Shoah vindicated the Zionist movement, which means not vindicated, but proved the necessity of a state of Israel. If there was once an argument, there are no arguments after the Shoah anymore. Because all we can say now is that too bad we didn't do it 30 years before. That was the feeling. And that's why I think it was 1951 they passed the law of Yad Vashem. And the Yad Vashem law is that this museum is for free, anybody wants to see it, and that all diplomats visiting the state of Israel have to go through Yad Vashem to understand why we need a state of Israel. But I want to mention another thing. You see, if you remember the Basel Convention or Congress of 1897, look for a platform that most Jews would agree upon, because two Jews, three ideas. You know the story about Reuven Caruso? You have this Jew who's living on an island all by himself, like that Tom Hanks movie where he's on an island deserted. So there's a Jew's living on an island for 20 years, and they discover him, call him Reuven Caruso. So Robinson Crusoe. So somebody comes over and says, "Well, can you show me the island before we go?" He says, "Of course." He says, "What's that?" "This is my house, a little hut I built. Lovely. What's the building next to it?" "That's my synagogue." "Ah, but there's another building over there, also a large one. What's that?" He says, "That's also a synagogue." He says, "You're only one person. Why do you need two synagogues?" He says, "Well, that's a synagogue I pray in, and that synagogue I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole." There's always a synagogue you pray in, and the one you wouldn't go into. So the Zionist conference looked for something which would be a common denominator that everybody could agree with. The platform of the 1897 Basel Conference was that we need a Jewish state because of anti-Semitism. So that was the platform. It wasn't talking about biblical prophecies and gathering of the exiles, bringing redemption, history, nothing. It was, we need a place to save the Jewish people because of anti-Semitism. And in 1905, 1904 or 5, when they had, I think it was the 5th Zionist conference, which was just after the pogrom in Kishinev, where hundreds of Jews have lost their lives in this pogrom in Kishinev, the Republic of Moldova. So then they started saying, we have to do something quickly. Right? If the whole point is against anti-Semitism, we have to do something quickly. And then they went to the British. Herzl went to the British, said, help us. British said, okay. It was called the Uganda Plan. We are in charge of Kenya. We can put you in Kenya if you want. Now, only Jews who hadn't lived in their land for 2,000 years would even entertain such a crazy idea. I mean, it was a totally crazy idea. Yes, we'll set up a state on the border with Kenya, and then in a few years, we'll move it. It was absolutely most ridiculous. So, but when you are afraid that you need some type of quick solution for anti-Semitism, you don't think clearly. It didn't happen in the end. But I'm just saying the very fact they entertained it, and the Herzl thought he had this great right? Proposition from the British, which they told him in like 1903. He died in 1903. But yeah, not long after that conference. So so the show on the one hand was sort of like the justification, which was now used for the state of Israel, had never been used before, but it now become too obvious that the Jews need a state. And that's why for the UN on the 29th of November, 1947, it was also obvious that the Jews needed a state. By the way, in the history of the United Nations, that was the only time that Russia and the United States had agreed on something, the UN. So, yeah, okay. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that the state of Israel had the Zionist movement had a problem with the Shoah. This manifested itself in the 1950s. You see, early Zionism, which was really promoted, I'm talking about from the second Aliyah forward, secular socialist Zionism, right? These were Jews who came from Russia and Poland, where communism was the thinking of the day. This was the new thinking, and the Jews were very socialist in the second Aliyah, the Aliyah of David Ben-Gurion and others. Those who became very involved in the labor movement and in the Jewish agency. And the idea was, their prototype was, it was the idea of it's like when you come into the Israeli army, in your initiation ceremony, you get your gun and you get the Tanakh, the Bible. I think a lot of people they don't even understand why, but that's, so the idea was you had a new generation who were willing to fight to continue Jewish history. This was the idea. There was a book written about Bugsy Siegel, written by a professor at Tel Aviv University. It was the story of Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel was one of the few Jews in the Chicago Mafia. He, by the way, established Las Vegas. He established the first casino in Las Vegas. Isn't it? Bugsy Siegel. Seigal, I think. Bugsy Siegel. There was one other, there was Meyer Lansky, but Meyer Lansky was more their money man. He was like the brains behind the Chicago Mafia, but Bugsy Siegel was a mafia guy, and he was killed eventually by somebody who didn't like him, like everybody in the mafia. But what happened was, before the state was founded, I think like in the 40s, somebody approached him from the yeshiva and said, we want to have a state, we need weapons, can you help us? And in this book about Bugsy Siegel says, Siegel was shocked. They're actually Jews who want to fight. I never even heard of that before, but they want machine guns. So he just thought that was very unusual. Because, usually Jews don't fight. That's what 2,000 years of being in exile does. So the Zionist movement was based on the idea of, if we can't get something through negotiation, we have to fight for it. And that's why only really the Shoah was able to justify it. Because it's not clear that without the Shoah, they would have had that much support from around the Jewish world for things where people could lose their lives. But it's easier to talk about things after the fact to justify them, because things could have also gone in different directions. Okay. Because things could have also gone in different directions, of course. In the 1950s, this became a very unusual issue. Yom HaShoah in Hebrew is called the Day of the Shoah and Courage. Shoah v'gvura. It's the day of the Holocaust and of courage. Why is it called the Day of the Holocaust and Courage? Because it happens every year on the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the 27th day of the month of Nisan, when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happened in 1943. So what was the courage? The courage were Jews who got up and defended themselves against the Nazis. I think it was Yitzhak Rabin who once said that the Israel Defense Forces were born in the Warsaw Ghetto, this association of the Jews who fought. But they had a difficulty with the Jews who didn't fight. But it was ridiculous to think that Jews are going to fight against a 10 million strong Nazi army. I mean, where are they going to get weapons from? Whoever taught them how to be soldiers? I mean, even to fathom that it was wrong for these people not to fight, I mean, they're just people. What do you expect them to do? They're not Rambo. Okay, Americans think that a Rambo can bring down a whole country, but most people don't, because it's not possible. It works well in Hollywood, doesn't. But as they say, don't try this at home. Okay, so it works at Hollywood. So I'm just saying that trying to blame people that they went like sheep to the slaughter, which was a term sometimes they used in the 1950s. And there were even survivors who were uncomfortable to say that they were survivors because of this. It took 20 years, I would say, for people to realize it was not their fault. And in fact, if anything, the courage was the very fact that they survived. That takes strength. It takes inner strength. There's a book you're probably familiar with, written by Viktor Frankl, called Man's Search for Meaning. I'm sure it's translated probably by a Sefer or something. And Frankl, as a psychiatrist, tried to understand what was it that helped people survive the camps. And he realized that it had to do with your inner commitment or determination. And this determination, usually he called it some belief, either the belief that you're going to survive, or the anticipation to meet a loved one who's waiting for you somewhere, or a belief in God, or a belief, whatever it was. I met this guy one time also in Krakow. He was a survivor. There were a lot of survivors in those years who were starting to come back and who for many years never wanted to see. And he told me the story that when he walks into Auschwitz the first day, and of course as a Jew, the numbers on your arm, and the guy puts the numbers on his arm, looks at him and says, "You're going to survive." And he turns to him and says, "How do you know? You're a prophet?" He says, "I just calculated the numbers on your arm, and it comes out to 18, which in Hebrew is chai, which means life. I know you're going to survive." He says, "I don't know how you knew it, but that's what happened." But sometimes, by somebody telling you that, and you start believing in that, it also gives you the power to continue. So in Frankl's book, there's a story there about this fellow who had a dream. Remember that? Maybe you might remember the story. And he whispers to Frankl in the morning, he says, "I had a dream." "What was it?" He said, "I dreamt that the war would be over for me." He says, "Really? And when's the war going to be over?" He says, "In my dream, they told me the 31st of May. It was February." And this guy was like, he says, it felt so real. And this guy was, every day he was like whistling and singing. It's like, he didn't have much to eat, but he really felt this 31st of May, he got inside information. And he says that, February came and went. March came and went. It was getting into April. He says by the middle of May, he was getting a little nervous. You see him getting fidgety because he expected to hear like some changes, whatever. By the 20th of May, he was looking a little bit sad. He said on the 29th of May, he got typhus and he died on the 30th. He says, well, the war was over for him on the 31st. When you lose your belief and your desire to live, then anything can happen. Because, you have an immune system. When you're depressed, you get sick. When you are feeling elated because, I don't know, you just won the Mundialito, or you just won Romania Has Talent, or I don't know what, or you just got your PhD in, I don't know, whatever. So Even if the body's working very well because the body gets excited because your brain knows that you're happy and that life is good. So you want to put up the fight.
And I saw that this the free food, the bag and the world, and that's a pretty great. So she fought and she was out because of the fault. And she did. And in the morning, then I went to sleep and to the crisis. They realized it was 20 times. But that actually didn't work. So he saw the way.
Oh, psychological, you're saying?
Yes.
Wow.
That's impressive because you explain what you can with the two letters.
Oh, in Hebrew language, every letter has a number. Aleph is 1, Beit is 2, Yud is 10, Kaf is 20, etc. So he said he figured out the numbers on his arm when we just counted them together, came out to 18. And 18 is Chet Yud, which is Chai, his life. Yes. So, okay, so I want to try to get this idea a little bit quicker. So, as I said, there was a problem in the 50s with the survivors. But by the 70s, by the 80s, people started realizing that it takes courage just to get through the camps. And a lot of luck, but definitely courage. And that we still call it Yom HaShoah VaGvura, the day of the Shoah and the day of courage. But now we realize, when I say we, the state, I'd say everybody in the state understands now that these survivors had the courage to live through those difficulties. Because those who didn't have the courage, they gave up. Some people just walked into the electric fences just like that. They just gave up. So you needed courage just to get through it. But these were growing pains, of the early years of the state. These were growing pains. And another thing, you see, when you have post-trauma, it affects the whole country. I think today, even today, in Israel, we see the Shoah as a justification for the state of Israel. Meaning, and this is probably true, the only thing that stands between the Jewish people today and another Shoah is probably the Israel Defense Forces. That's just a truism, because there are a lot of people who don't like us. On the other hand, it's not healthy to know that. To feel that you have all these enemies. Don't you notice how Israelis are such big travelers? Just look how many every day, every flight I've taken from Wizz Air, and I've been here 3 times in the last 2 months, I think, right? It's full to the brim of Israelis who, okay, they can afford a Romania more than Paris, London, places like that. But I'm just saying Israelis love to travel because sometimes you get this feeling that it's hard to live when you think that a lot of people don't like you. There was this woman I met, and she from Sweden, who converted to Judaism. And you gave a class one time, and I think to myself, this poor woman, until now, everybody in Europe loved her because she was from Sweden. Now she'd be Jewish, even her own friends won't like her anymore. It's like that. It was very courageous of her. I even told her that. Maybe I shouldn't have told her that, but I did. It's like, and you don't know why. So, but getting back to this. So Israelis, in my opinion, they actually think that there is a narrative. First of all, there's definitely this narrative that the Shoah justifies the state of Israel. Definitely a narrative, and I would say that even the Ministry of Education, when they take these kids 10th grade, 11th grade to Poland, that's what they're doing. In my opinion, they're making some mistakes because the average Israeli, when you say Poland, they think of the Shoah. When they say Germany, they think of Berlin, which is that cool city. it's like something got mixed up on the way. That's one of our problems in Israel. I try to fight against this, and I explain this to my students at Bar Ilan, that the show was actually the Germans, it wasn't the Poles. They were just an occupied country. I'm not saying every Polish person is the Mother Teresa, but I'm just saying that it wasn't them. The fact that it happened on their land is, just incidental. There was reasons for it, of course. But anyhow, so I don't justify anything the present government of Poland is doing because they're acting ridiculous. But for everything ridiculous, there's a slight grain of truth, but not the way they're promoting it. Well, so I'm just saying that in Israel we have that problem. The people forgot it's Germany. There's a lot of reason for that, but I don't want to get into that. It also has to do with the fact that Israel took the reparations from Germany very early on. And I don't blame Ben Gurion for that because I never started a country, so I assume they did need the money. But there's a price that you pay when you forgive your enemies too quickly. Enemies that fought you when you had no way of fighting back. There is a price that you pay for that. And what I just said now is just symptomatic of it. The people associate Poland with the Shoah, not Germany. But getting back to this, another thing it created in Israel is this feeling that everybody hates us because that's Shoah survivors had this feeling the whole world hated them. And it's not true. But there are people who don't. What happens is when you have this mentality of everybody hates us, if somebody doesn't figure, okay, they're just not normal. Let's go to the next one. That's also part of this post-traumatic stress, in my opinion. But all that I want to put aside. It's also, by the way, perpetuated by the fact that we've had a few wars. And the goal of the wars was to push us into the sea. That doesn't exactly make you feel better. So I'm just saying that, a lot of these things perpetuate themselves. It's not a healthy situation. And I hope we get over it because it's, I always say to people, you know what? They're too, in the United States, they take it to the other, every place you have Jewish studies, everything's Shoah, Shoah, Shoah. Too much. Somebody once said to me, what do you mean? There's no business like Shoah business. So it's too much in the sense that I don't want to be known as a victim. I want people to know about the Jewish people because we have a message. The fact that we were a victim, that was not our choice. So why should we want to be a victim? I don't even understand people who want to be called a victim. The generation who are victims, they didn't choose to be victims. Choosing to be a victim is pathetic. And so I don't even want to perpetuate it. We have something to show. We have a tradition. We have ideas. We even have a country now, which picked itself up despite everything that happened and didn't wait for anybody to have mercy on it. So, so I'm just saying that. But that's only one way of reacting to the Shoah, state of Israel. And definitely this is the way it's understood in the state. Reaction number two. You come to the United States, which nobody really knows how many Jews are in the United States. They say 6 million. But nobody knows. In 1930, there was a census. There were 5 million Jews in the United States. How was the census done? You were supposed to answer one of the two questions, your religion and your ethnicity. So somehow it was supposed to come out in some way. But in 1960, they stopped the census. They didn't stop the census. They stopped the obligation to answer ethnicity or religion. Just like in Romania, you don't have it anymore. So nobody knows since 1960 how many Jews are in the United States. There might not be any. Who knows? There might be 20 million. I'm just saying everything is just assumptions based on what happened in 1960. But nobody actually knows how many there are. Or in England, or the only country we actually know is in Israel. Even Romania, you never know. Krakow, they have a joke. They say that whenever the last Jew in Krakow goes to the train station to leave, all his 200 relatives say goodbye. Nobody really knows these things. I was just at a meeting at Bar Ilan. There's a woman there, Christina Hayes. So she was supposed to, she was asked that she's actually an expert in Jewish studies. So somebody said, wow, they're bringing a non-Jew to be the expert. And somebody said, she's Jewish. You never really know with things like that. But I don't. But in the United States, the shoah was seen very different. Remember, people left Europe and they were accepted by the United States after. Remember, the United States had closed its doors from 1930 until after the war. And many, many Jews were left into the United States after the war, even from, by the way, from Russia. That's why most Jews were associated with Russian foods in the United States. Like if you walk into a supermarket that sells kosher for Pesach, so you'll see borscht. It'll be kosher borscht. And of course, gefilte fish, and also pcha, and like all these like other Russian stuff. And the Russians who now live there, they say, why is it in the kosher section? It's like, what does that have to do with anything? Even bagels and lox, what does that have to do with Jews? That was a Polish. But I'm just saying that because the Jews were allowed in after the war, and they brought in these Russian and Polish foods, so people associated with Jews, even though it had really nothing to do with them. So Jews in the United States were very appreciative to the countries that took them in, just like they were in Canada and Australia, South Africa, England, France, whatever the countries were. And this gave this feeling not of, okay, maybe Jews who are a little bit more traditionally oriented or observant also agreed with the narrative in Israel. But the average Jew who's not so religious, let's say, in the United States, they don't see the connection between the Shoah and Jewish nationalism. What's wrong with living in the United States? We can make a nice life here. We can get ahead. You can even make jokes about Jews and people will laugh and be respectful. Yeah. You know how many Jewish comedians you have in the United States? And they make jokes about themselves. By the way, if you try to do the same thing in France and England, it's not going to work. It'll turn into anti-Semitism. But the United States will just, like everybody just jokes about something. But I mean, the mark of a country is when it doesn't faze anybody. Remember this, there's a newspaper called Canadian Jewish News. Of the Jewish community, it's published in Montreal, Toronto, and I think also in Vancouver. And they were telling me a story about this guy a Jewish guy who went from France to Montreal, which is of course French-speaking province of Quebec. And they asked him what his experiences were. He says, my first week of the job was shocking. Said, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and somehow, for some reason in the discussion, I mentioned the fact that I was Jewish. And the conversation continued as if I had said nothing of significance. He says, that would never happen in France. If I'm talking to anybody in France and would mention I'm Jewish, the conversation would stop. They would say something like, oh, wouldn't even occur to me. Or, really, are you? Oh, that's so, or something, like they would have to say something. Says, but in Montreal, they didn't even say anything, like nothing. That's what successful integration is. One of the problems they're having now in the United States, they're going backwards. After they integrated the Afro-Americans, now they want to talk about white privilege and things like that, which is really going backwards. You don't want to talk about racism anymore. You want it to be behind. I mean, they interviewed, I think it was Denzel Washington, ask him about these things. He says, we've got to get over this. And if you keep talking about it, we're never going to get over it. Just let it go. We're doing fine. So anyhow, so in the United States, then what is the Shoah? The Shoah for the Jews who were the survivors was this idea that it's to remind us that there are minorities, that we have to support people's rights all over the world when they're being oppressed. And this has become a major narrative. Definitely of the reform movement in the United States, to a great extent, the conservative movement in the United States, and among many, many secular Jews in the United States, who today are, by the way, probably at least half of the Jewish community, the unaffiliated. This idea that we have to stand up for the rights of everybody because we experienced the shoah. So if there's somebody, minority, somewhere in this world, if somebody's starving in Biafra, we have to be the ones who stand up because we experienced something just like this. It's a lovely idea. But they forget that the Shoah actually singled out the Jewish people. It wasn't by chance. Whereas Israelis don't forget that. Because you can easily forget that. And and again, it's just talking about the Shoah as being the victim. There are lots of victims in life. And but is there a message? Is there a Jewish message to the Shoah too? In Israel, the Jewish message was the need to continue the Jewish people at every price, at any price. But in the United States, it's not that. So I'm just saying how you have different reactions. Again, the religious Jews in the United States would say both. But the ones who are more assimilated, they don't see why it has to do with anything perpetuating Jews. What's the point of perpetuating Jews in the first place? There has to be a reason for it. And they're right. If it's just a country club, there is no reason. In Montreal, they used to have a golf club where Jews were not allowed. And as Jews became more affluent in the city, they bought the golf club and then became a Jewish golf club. But if Judaism is just a Jewish golf club, then what do we need it for? So, and I totally understand secular Jews who don't see the point because they have no idea what it's about. Because if Judaism is just being Jewish, that's meaningless, right? There's got to be a message. In post-communist countries and communist countries, Judaism was defined as an ethnicity, not as a religion. This idea of the ethnicity of the Jews starts in the end of the 19th century. Remember, during the in Spain, during the trying to remember the English words, I get mixed it up with Hebrew now sometimes because I teach in Hebrew all the time. But during the Inquisition, if you decided to convert to Catholicism, it was over. Right? There was no problem. Of course, if you did it not wholeheartedly, then you would be under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. But the point is, Jews thought, convert to Christianity and it's over. But in the 19th century, it didn't help. When Jews assimilated, Germany, France, England, it didn't stop anti-Semitism because it all of a sudden became a racial idea, an ethnicity. There was nowhere to go. Now, Jews living in communist countries has continued too. Jews were a minority, it was an ethnicity. You know that in Poland today, according to the law, Jews are defined as a minority. And since all minorities, in Romania too, since all minorities have a language in a country, so their country is Israel, and their language is Hebrew, despite the fact that the Jews in Poland, they don't speak Hebrew, and they've never been to Israel. But you have to have a definition, right? So that was the difference. Okay, Romanian it might work because you have so many Israelis coming here, but in Poland, I don't think that definition would hold water. But it's just interesting, this concept. In the United States, for instance, like in Canada, most Jews see being Jewish as a religion, not necessarily as an ethnicity. Well, it's definitely both. It's definitely both. But remember, Judaism also comes from a time in antiquity where every people had their own God. So in that sense, every nationalism had their own faith. So we also had our own God, but it was the one God. But that's why the other people didn't understand us. So because in antiquity, by the time in the time of the Bible, everybody said their God was the best, but they never said their God was the only one. And we said ours is the only one. So people didn't like that. It was like a little intolerant. I got it. The Greeks think that Zeus is the best. Got it, right? And the Egyptians think that Ra is the best. We got that too. And the Philistines think Dagon. But say that ours is like meaningless, doesn't even exist. Huh? Okay. So, so that was, that's why sometimes in the Bible, God is called the God of Israel when the Jews talk, because then the nations wouldn't understand what they're talking about if they didn't say the God of Israel. Because all gods were nationalistic. So that's why very often in the Bible it says the God of Israel will fight your army, because then the enemy wouldn't even understand what they're talking about. If you just said God, well, which one? It's like when Moses comes to Pharaoh and he says, the God, God, the God of my forefathers has sent me. Pharaoh says, who's this God? And why should I send away the Israelites because of this God? It's like, I opened up my dictionary of all the gods of Canaan. He's not even on the list. Okay, that part it doesn't say. But I'm just saying, but this was like the reaction in antiquity. If you were a nation, which they weren't, right? If you're a nation and this nation had a God, I remember that's the way it worked. But you guys are saying there's this like one God. And okay. So okay, that threw me off a little bit. So I'm just saying that there's a different relationship between way Jews see the Shoah, let's say in the United States. I'm talking about Jews who are less committed to observance than Jews in Israel. A third relationship to the Shoah. The Haredi Jews, ultra-Orthodox. There are actually different parts of the ultra-Orthodox world. There are many shades of black, even though it doesn't seem like it. Like, for instance, what we call Hasidic Jews are very different than what we call Lithuanian Haredi Jews. Haredi means ultra-Orthodox. In fact, the whole mindset is different. They even disagree with each other. But for political reasons, they vote for the same party, but they totally disagree with each other. Sephardic Haredi is also very different because it's new. It's a novelty. There never was Sephardic Haredi. It was created by, the generation of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. It never really existed in the idea of the insular community, etc. That was also something new. The Haredi community, though, especially the Ashkenazi Haredi community, went through the Shoah. Even though it wasn't just Ashkenazi in the Shoah, you had Greek Jews who went through the Shoah, you had Libyan Jews in the Shoah. But what I'm saying is that the ultra-Orthodox world had real problems with what to do, how to understand the Shoah and how to teach it. And for many, many years, they didn't teach it in their educational systems at all, in their schools and in their yeshivot. And the reason was that they were afraid that it would lead to discussions that they wouldn't be able to deal with. About faith, about why there's evil in the world. Not that there's anybody who knows how to deal with these discussions. Maybe to deal with the discussions yet, but I've always said that it's a lack of faith to think that you have to have the answer to every question in order to have faith. I said it's a lack of faith to think that you have to have the answer to every question, because being human means we don't have the answer to every question. That's by definition. And the fact that there are people who think, and this happens a lot within the Haredi community, unfortunately, they think that if I don't give an answer, it means that there's a problem. No, sometimes when you give an answer, it's a problem because you're lying. That's not good. People want honesty. That's the difference between metaphysical philosophy and theology. Theology means I have to win at any cost. That's wrong. I'm using theology in a very narrow-minded way. Hope you understand that. I'm not talking about in the general subject of theology. But very often when use the term theologian in a derogatory manner. We're talking about people who just want to convince you that they're right. And I don't even know when they go home if they actually agree with what they just said. But the main thing is to win the argument. So, but people are honest. They say the problems. That's not that's just being honest. So the shoah, as I said, had specifically on the state of Israel, definitely has an impact to this day. But it's also seen as a justification a lot for the state. That's why it's so close to Israel Independence Day. But I think it's also very important for Israelis to get out of the victim concept. This idea that the whole world hates us. It's really unhealthy. And because what happens is two things happen when you think the whole world hates us. On the one hand, there'll be people say, okay, don't even listen to them because they hate us anyhow. There's nothing you can do. They're all anti-Semitic. It's not true, but they're going to think that way. And then you're not going to even try. And that's not fair because the vast majority of people don't have opinion. They really don't know. It's just the ones who make a lot of noise. They pretend that everybody knows. And even some of the people who demonstrate don't even know what they're talking about. And then on the other hand, what it'll do is it could even create what I call, they call in psychology, Stockholm syndrome. Jews who actually want to become like these other people, because if we can't solve the problem, let's just join them. If it's really insolvable. So it's not. In that sense, I'm thankful that I grew up in a country where I did not have to experience anti-Semitism, because it's not a good way to look at the world. And and I don't like when you have Israeli politicians going to countries and telling the Jews, make Aliyah because there's going to be anti-Semitism here. No, I don't want to hear that. I don't want them to, if there's anti-Semitism in France, I want it to stop. If they want to make Aliyah, that's another thing. But I don't want them to run away from France because there's anti-Semitism. That's ridiculous. Yeah. Yeah.
And she told me, I recognize my daughter because she so democratic and free and nice with everybody. And she says, when I'm in Tel Aviv, I sometimes feel the urge of being a Canadian in Tel Aviv. I want to think like a Canadian. Because it's a peace of mind, not to be so stressed in like everybody. So she wants to be Jewish because this is why she's in Israel now. She wants to assume she's a Jewish, but she brings the Canadian side in Tel Aviv in her life.
Yeah, you have to grow up there to understand. It takes a generation.
Exactly.
To really understand.
Yes.
So it's a different mindset. So that's what I wanted to say. I think that's enough for that topic. Should we take a break now downstairs? Okay, let's take one more picture because a few more people walked in. We'll get somebody to take the picture and I'll fill in the seats. It's just, do you mind if the two of you could just move over here to fill in the seats one more? And then we'll just take the picture on this side. If there's somebody on the outside who could take the picture, you see somebody in the hallway. There's nobody here.
It was the first time.
Wow.
And after
We'll throw once more, but I think we could put it, there's a way of putting it on a timer, right?
I think yes.
This is Samsung. You know how?
Let's see. A minute. So 2 seconds, 5 seconds, and 10 seconds.
Make it more than that. 20 seconds.
20 seconds. I don't think I can.
Okay, so somebody can film The seats here, let's get this. Is there somebody here?
Yes.
Yeah, sure, sure.
We have a gathering.
Oh,
We have a conference.
I did not know that. Very good. Yeah. Huh? Oh, I'm still recording. I'm gonna hold the recording for a moment.